Fate is a peculiar force. As humans, we have been enchanted with the notion of fate, destiny, synchronicity, or whatever you want to call it for, well, forever. The forces of fate fall into place a great many times throughout our personal and collective histories, often prodding and provoking the most pivotal moments into potentiality. Take, for instance, the story of a cigar that led to a fortuitous turn of events in the Civil War. In September 1862, the Confederate Army prepared to invade the North, a move that would push them forward into Union territory and allow them to capture key cities. General Robert E. Lee had these fateful plans written down on paper and distributed them to his officers, including one General Daniel Hill. But Daniel made a whoopsie-daisies. He wrapped the plans around several cigars, which he promptly lost. A few days later, Union soldiers were traversing a field near Frederick, Maryland, when they came across a piece of paper along with a few cigars. Perhaps initially most interested in the cigars, they took the paper, gave it a once-over, and realized that they held the fates of thousands in their hands. They now knew the plot of the Confederates. This single fateful encounter resulted directly in the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in U.S. history, which marked the turning point of the war. Because the Union forces were able to intercept the Confederates near Antietam Creek, they were able to force their retreat back into the South and turn the war in their favor. They were, it seems, some very fateful cigars. Whether or not you believe in the concept of fate, which is admittedly a controversial notion, we can all more or less agree with the idea that we are all born with a set of potentialities. We come into this life with an expansive suite of possibilities, and it is up to each and every one of us to nudge and judge those potentialities closer and closer to reality. Whether or not our potential is something that is predetermined, I will leave up to you. But we can all reasonably accept that we each have an upper and lower limit on our potential as a human, and it can be considered our life's work to snuggle close to the upper edge of what we can become. In the words of Dante Alighieri, "Do not be afraid. Our fate cannot be taken from us. It is a gift." But we don't always lean into our greatest destiny. In fact, we often shy away from it or even fight it off tooth and nail. Instead of welcoming our shiniest, loveliest potential, we tend to, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, turn away, finding ourselves overwhelmed, intimidated, guilted, or downright frightened by it. Instead of letting the winds of fate push us along, we have a tendency to do an about-face, confronting the wind head-on, and then wonder why we are standing still with the storm lashing against us. When we consider why we fail to achieve our destiny, it's easy to explain it away through lack of resources or other forces working against us, like a lack of parental love, or persistent episodes of depression, or an extra 10 pounds that we can't seem to lose. But our failure to self-actualize more often has to do with the much more insidious, much darker kind of threat. Sabotage against ourselves. Hi, I'm Jessica Carson, and welcome to Patina, a podcast that examines the surprising beauty of all that is dark, shadowy, and seemingly tarnished about the human experience. Let's play. The Jonah Complex is simply defined as the fear of success, a fear of being the best we can be, a fear of claiming what we are worthy of. In short, the Jonah Complex is a resistance around stepping into our most sparkly fate, our greatest potential. Now, I know this may sound confusing. You may be thinking, who doesn't want the best for themselves? The answer, as it turns out, is a lot of us. I suffer from it to varying degrees, and you almost certainly do as well. Who hasn't settled for the subpar partner, too low salary, or understimulating job? Who hasn't said no to a picture-perfect opportunity that was placed in our laps out of fear of both failure or, perhaps even worse, success? You might have already guessed this, but the muse for the Jonah Complex is none other than Jonah from the Bible. Regardless of how religious you might be, most of us have at least heard of Jonah in passing, largely associated with his uncomfortably dramatic fate of being swallowed by a whale. As the story goes, God called upon Jonah to preach in the city of Nineveh, which happened to be filled to the brim with the so-called wicked. Jonah, however, was not enthused by God's request to be a spokesperson sent to cure the evil of their ways, particularly because Nineveh was one of Israel's greatest enemies. The idea of preaching to these unholy folk was so unappealing to Jonah that he, in a rather interesting futile effort, decided he was going to run away from God. Now, if any of us were called upon by the celebrity that is God, we would probably just shut up and listen. I mean, if God asks for you by name, regardless of your pre-existing beliefs, you are either checking yourself into a mental institution or you are taking that request very, very seriously. But Jonah was not of this mind. He instead chose to turn and run from this assignment from on high. He had no interest in carrying out this task of fate, and instead hopped on a ship to flee from his destiny. This denial of his great task displeased God, and so a bit of chaos ensued, as tended to happen when Old Testament God was in a mood. God sent a tempestuous storm, and the men on the ship decided Jonah was to blame. They threw him overboard, and he was promptly swallowed by a whale. Whilst inside the belly of the whale, Jonah had a sort of time out. He had time and space to think about what he had done, or more appropriately, what he had chosen not to do. In this contemplative place of darkness and depths, akin to the unconscious, Jonah had an epiphany. He apologized to God for his sheepish refusal of his call of destiny, after which God nudged the whale to throw up, tossing Jonah onto the shores of Nineveh. And as it turned out, Jonah could have saved himself a lot of suffering if he had simply accepted his call of greatness from the outset, because, well, his preaching worked. The people of Nineveh turned away from their wicked ways and solicited God's mercy in the process. And so, the late psychologist Abraham Maslow adopted the story of Jonah to illustrate his theory of the Jonah Complex. Essentially, he believed it was a phenomenon in which our ambivalence or fear around growth can keep us from becoming all that we are meant to be. It is simultaneously a fear of grandiosity, arrogance, or hubris, a fear of doing what we are most capable of doing, and a concern that people will dislike us for being the fullest, most successful version of ourselves. In the words of Maslow, quote, "We fear our highest possibilities. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments, under the most perfect conditions, under conditions of great courage. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves in such peak moments. And yet, we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe, and fear before these very same possibilities. So often, we run away from the responsibilities dictated, or rather suggested by nature, by fate, even sometimes by accident, just as Jonah tried in vain to run away from his fate. End quote. You see, we all have a desire to improve ourselves, and this is captured by Maslow's concept of self-actualization. We all contain urges to develop into the highest potential of who we can become and achieve the success that we are born worthy of. And so, if self-actualization is the urge, then the Jonah Complex is the self-sabotaging mechanism by which we intentionally or unintentionally compromise our ability to self-actualize. It's an attack from within, and that can make it particularly hard to identify and perhaps even harder to combat. After all, it seems that the enemy that lives within us is the most fearsome enemy of them all. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a doctor, and I let this be known to all who would listen. In fact, I said it so often that I still have to remind extended family members that I did not, in fact, go to medical school. Now, before I continue, let me just say, being a doctor is badass. It's an amazing career for people with a degree of patience that I may never know. But I wanted to be a doctor for all the wrong reasons. You see, I liked the idea of being a doctor because it would allow me to be successful along a prescribed path. If I followed a certain number of steps in a certain order, I would be guaranteed a respectable degree of success. Most importantly, becoming a doctor did not necessarily require me to risk going off on my own and carving my own path, with all the potential failure that could come along with it. I knew that being a doctor might not have been my personal highest potentiality, but I liked it because I didn't think I was capable or maybe even worthy of creating a more personalized career that was a better reflection of my unique strengths and interests and abilities. And here we see the Jonah Complex in action. I knew that medicine was not the best path for me, though it certainly can be for many, but I was too scared to wade into the murky, uncertain waters of a more aligned potential for my life. And so, for a while, I set my sights on this career path, until I had my Jonah moment. One day, I found myself sitting inside a laboratory, scanning brains at the National Institutes of Health, a dark, echoey, cold room that felt something like the belly of a whale, and I had my turning point. I realized that an uncertain path toward my highest potential was infinitely better than a certain path toward a life that I didn't really want. And so, I purged myself from the belly of the whale, quit my fellowship, and entered the strange and special world of startups, a decision that set me on the path to where I am today. But, of course, the Jonah Complex doesn't only show up in our professional pursuits. It encourages us to underachieve and settle for less in a wide array of our life contexts. Let's take an example that we have all done at some point or another, settling for a romantic partner who offers us less than what we deserve. We continue on in these subpar relationships and tell ourselves things like, well, no couple is perfect, or happy couples are just faking it, or happy relationships are rare and only for the lucky. We may also tell ourselves things like, this is the best I can do, or I'm just too old and too tired to go out and cast my line again. But meanwhile, deep down inside of us, we know the truth. In this lackluster relationship, we are running away from the brightest version of our future selves and settling for an option that may be tolerable at best or soul-shriveling at worst. It is often only in hindsight that we can say, how the hell did I think that was the best I could do? So, who does the Jonah Complex affect the most? From a life circumstances perspective, the Jonah Complex is particularly common in the moments of our lives when we're challenged, like when we embark on a career change, move to a new city, or enter a new stage of life, like a marriage or having a child. All of these challenges present the opportunity for rapid growth and expansion, but this growth can also feel scary and overwhelming. So, instead of leaning into the opportunity for transformation, we stay quiet, watch Netflix, deny our needs, or suppress the most sparkly parts of ourselves to make another person comfortable. Lord knows I have dimmed my sparkle way too many times to make another person, in particular a partner or a friend, a bit more comfortable. From a personality perspective, the Jonah Complex has been associated with neuroticism, which is a personality trait characterized by the disposition to experience negative affect, like anger, anxiety, self-consciousness, irritability, and instability. Neuroticism is not a condition per se, but is rather a trait that exists on a spectrum, with the opposite end being someone characterized by stability and contentment. And so, it makes sense that those of us who are a bit neurotic, meaning moody and subject to the whims of change, are more prone to suffering from the misguided directions of our inner saboteur. But whether we are neurotic or not, Maslow said that we as humans counterintuitively avoid greatness because we harbor a private ambition to be spectacular. Few, if any of us, are born thinking that we could never be a movie star or an astronaut. Instead, we are born full of potential and big dreams. But then, as we come across the realities of the world and witness the people who do excel in their lives, relationships, and careers, we tend to forge an inner self-dialogue that goes something like, who the hell am I to think I deserve as much fame, success, or love? As a result, we tend to lower our aspirations, adopt a self-deprecating tone, or embody the role of a victim in an effort to explain why we have not met our potential. But what's interesting about the Jonah Complex is that its presence, while seemingly foreboding, is actually mixed with gold. You see, research into the Jonah Complex has found that those of us who respond yes to questions like, I regret that I'm not doing all that I could to move towards my dreams, show a positive correlation with initiation, persistence, social efficacy, and efficacy in the face of adversity. In other words, those of us who feel a power and obligation to achieve our potential, even and perhaps especially when we're falling short of that existential obligation, are more likely to take initiative and change our ways. And so, In this sense, knowing that the Jonah Complex is at play in our lives does not necessarily have to be an obstacle to self-actualization, but can actually be a precursor to it. After all, we have to have an awareness of our self-sabotaging tendencies and a willingness to overcome them in order to activate the wholest versions of ourselves. So, it seems that the experience of the Jonah Complex is not in and of itself the problem. The problem is when we don't do the shadow work to recognize when we're halting our own growth. It's when we live in a victim mentality instead of admitting that we are perhaps our own worst suppressors. The problem isn't as much the self-sabotage as it is the obliviousness to that self-sabotage. In the words of Carl Jung, we cannot change anything until we accept it. And so, this begs the question, what can we do if we find ourselves in bed with Jonah? The complex, that is. Well, there's not a cure if that's what you're looking for, nor would that make